Choi Sang-won, the man whose name made the strongest men in Incheon tremble, stood in the center of a silent, echoing mansion that felt more like a tomb than a home. In his arms, little Do-hyun was a ghost, a weightless, fading shadow of the boy he had once been. The boy's pale, translucent skin was stretched tight over ribs that looked like bird bones, and his eyes, once bright with life, were now hollow and distant. Sang-won's heavily tattooed hands, accustomed to the weight of power and the grip of iron, shook as he held his son against the sharp, sapphire-blue fabric of his tailored suit. On the polished mahogany table sat a bowl of gold leaf broth, its steam carrying the scent of $100 delicacy. It was the work of a master from Kyoto, the 70th world-class chef to be summoned and subsequently discarded. With a single, cold flick of his wrist, Sang-won signaled his guards. The chef was dragged from the room, his pleas for a second chance echoing down the marble hallway until the heavy oak doors muffled his cries. The failure was absolute, and in Sang-won's world, failure was the only sin that could not be forgiven. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sang-won's empire was the largest in the country, built on blood, loyalty, and a fortune that could buy anything except his son's appetite. He had brought in 30 of the world's leading specialists, and they had all retreated with the same terrifying verdict: there was nothing physically wrong. The boy had simply stopped wanting to live. The maids and guards whispered in the shadows of the estate, their voices thick with superstition. Some said the Choi bloodline was finally paying the price for the lives Sang-won had taken to reach the top. Others whispered that the spirit of the boss's late wife was calling her child to the other side, unable to bear him living in a world of violence. Sang-won didn't believe in ghosts, but as he watched the shallow, labored rise and fall of Do-hyun's chest, he felt a primal, crushing desperation. He had everything: absolute authority, fast cars, and more money than the city could count, but it was all ash if he could not save his heir. He had posted a $10 million reward, a king's ransom that had drawn culinary masters from every corner of the globe. They came with their private jets and their rare ingredients, yet not one could get the boy to take a single spoonful. Sang-won was officially out of options. As a cold Incheon rain began to lash against the towering windows, the boss held his son tighter, terrified that the next breath might be the boy's last. He was the most powerful man in the city, and yet, in the face of his son's starvation, he was utterly helpless. The rain over Incheon was a cold, unrelenting weight that turned the sky into a sheet of slate. At the edge of the city, behind iron gates that stood like sentinels, the Choi estate loomed, a fortress of glass and dark stone that felt more like a monument to grief than a home. High-definition security cameras hummed as they swiveled, capturing the image of a lone figure standing in the deluge. She looked like a ghost from a different world. ChiChi Okoye stood before the intercom, her thin jacket plastered to her skin and her shoes filled with the icy runoff of the driveway. She was 20 years old, carrying nothing but a salt-stained backpack and a heart that refused to be quieted by the intimidating display of wealth. Beneath her wet layers, the corner of a faded, hand-stitched apron peeked out, the only tool she truly owned. To the guards in the security booth, armed with automatic weapons and dressed in crisp black suits, she was an eyesore. They watched her through the monitors, laughing as they placed bets on how long she would stand there before the cold broke her. "Move along," a voice crackled through the speaker, distorted and bored. "This isn't a place for charity." ChiChi didn't move. She stepped closer to the lens, her face pale from the chill but her expression unyielding. "I'm not here for charity," she said, her voice cutting through the sound of the storm. "I'm here for the boy. I'm here to cook." Another burst of laughter erupted from the booth, but eventually, the gate groaned open just enough to let a delivery truck pass, and ChiChi slipped through. She marched up the winding driveway, past manicured gardens that looked like they belonged in a museum, until she reached the massive oak doors of the main house. When the head maid opened the door, she was greeted by a puddle of rainwater and a girl who looked like she had walked across the ocean. The maid's face contorted in immediate disgust. The foyer was a cathedral of white marble and gold leaf, a space so sterile and perfect that even the air felt expensive. Out. Get out right now, the maid hissed, reaching for ChiChi's shoulder to shove her back into the rain. Do you have any idea where you are? This is the house of Choi Sang-won. We don't allow beggars past the porch. I saw the notice, ChiChi replied, standing her ground. Her damp clothes dripped onto the marble, an ugly blemish on the floor's perfection. 70 chefs have come and gone. Your masters and your experts have failed. If you throw me out now, you are choosing to let that little boy die. The maid froze, her hand hovering in the air. The mention of Do-hyun was a taboo in the house, a wound so deep that no one dared touch it. Just as the woman opened her mouth to call for security, a heavy, rhythmic footfall echoed from the grand staircase. Choi Sang-won descended the stairs like a storm cloud. He was a man of terrifying presence, his tailored navy suit fitting perfectly over shoulders that carried the weight of an underworld empire. His neck was marked by the ink of his past, and his eyes were dark with a fatigue that no amount of money could cure. In his arms, he carried a small, silent bundle wrapped in a cashmere blanket. Do-hyun was so frail he barely made a dent in his father's embrace, his tiny face sunken and his eyes half closed. The staff immediately fell into a bow, their heads lowered in fear. Sang-won didn't look at them. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, his gaze landing on the soaking wet girl standing in his entryway. He saw the torn hem of her pants, the cheap fabric of her jacket, and the mud on her shoes. He should have ordered his men to dispose of her. He should have been insulted by her presence. But then, ChiChi looked up. She didn't bow. She didn't tremble. She looked directly into the eyes of the most feared man in Incheon. In that moment, Sang-won saw something he hadn't seen in the 70 chefs who had come before her. He didn't see the desire for the $10 million reward. He didn't see the arrogance of a culinary degree or the fear of a subordinate. He saw a fierce, quiet determination, a fire that burned with the same intensity as the one he used to rule his city. It was the look of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. You think you can do what the masters of the world could not? Sang-won asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to vibrate the very floor. They were cooking for a boss, ChiChi said, her voice steady. I am cooking for a child. A flicker of something, perhaps respect, or perhaps just a final, desperate hope, passed over Sang-won's face. He looked at his son's pale hand, which was limp against his chest, and then back at the girl. He realized that the luxury and the experts had only brought him closer to a funeral. Let her in, Sang-won commanded. The head maid gasped, her face turning pale. But boss, the floors, she's filthy. I said let her in, he repeated, the edge in his voice sharp enough to draw blood. He turned back to ChiChi. The kitchen is yours. But understand this, if you waste my time, if you give my son hope only to fail him, there is no corner of this earth where you can hide from me. ChiChi didn't flinch. She simply adjusted the strap of her backpack and walked past the shocked servants. She headed toward the back of the house, toward the cold, professional kitchen that had become a graveyard of expensive meals. She didn't need their recipes or their gold leaf garnishes. She had the memory of a mother's kitchen, a bag of spices from home, and eyes that saw a way to bring a ghost back to life. The steel and chrome expanse of the mansion's kitchen felt like a laboratory for a science that had forgotten its humanity. It was a place of cold surfaces and silent, expensive shadows, where the air usually smelled of clinical disinfectants and the lingering, bitter musk of Choi Sang-won's imported cigars. As ChiChi stepped into the center of the room, the professional kitchen staff retreated into the corners like a tide pulling back from a foreign shore. They stood with their arms crossed over their white tunics, their eyes filled with a mixture of mockery and disbelief. To them, she was a smudge on a clean canvas, a girl with mud on her shoes who dared to enter a temple of haute cuisine. ChiChi didn't look at them. She didn't look at the high-tech induction ranges or the rows of German-engineered knives that cost more than her entire village's yearly harvest. Instead, she moved to a heavy gas stove at the far end of the island, the only one that looked like it could handle the raw power of a real flame. She reached into her backpack, her movements deliberate and rhythmic, and pulled out a heavy iron pot. It was scorched at the bottom, darkened by years of fire and family, and as she set it down on the grate, the sound of metal meeting metal echoed through the silent house like a challenge. The transformation began with a single spark. ChiChi turned the knob, and a crown of blue fire roared to life, casting flickering shadows against the polished marble walls. She reached for a jar of deep, sunset orange palm oil. As she poured it into the pot, the heavy, earthen scent began to rise, thick and rich, immediately clashing with the sterile atmosphere of the estate. It was a smell of the earth, of sun-drenched soil and ancient trees, a smell that had no business being in a Mafia stronghold in Incheon. Then came the Scotch bonnets. She sliced them with a simple, silver-handled knife she had carried in her pocket, the vibrant red and yellow skins yielding to reveal seeds that held the heat of 1,000 summers. When they hit the hot oil, the air in the kitchen didn't just change, it exploded. A sharp, spicy bloom of heat billowed upward, an aggressive and alive aroma that began to crawl through the vents and under the heavy oak doors. It pushed back the scent of cold stone and tobacco, replacing the mansion's suffocating gloom with a fragrance that was fierce, honest, and unapologetically bold. The kitchen staff began to cough, their eyes watering as the potent spice filled the room, but ChiChi didn't flinch. She stood over the blazing stove, her posture a picture of quiet strength. The fire reflected in her dark eyes, making her look less like a servant and more like a priestess performing a sacred rite. She added onions, the sizzle sounding like a sudden downpour on a tin roof, and then the aromatic blend of ginger and garlic that made the air heavy with promise. From the doorway, Choi Sang-won watched in silence. He had traded his tailored jacket for a simpler vest, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark, intricate tattoos that told the story of a man who had survived 1,000 wars. He had seen the greatest chefs in the world perform here, moving with a calculated, robotic precision. But this was different. ChiChi moved with a fluid, instinctive grace, her senses tuned to the crackle of the oil and the changing color of the rice as she stirred it into the vibrant, red base. She wasn't following a recipe written in a book, she was following a memory written in her blood. The heat in the kitchen rose until the air shimmered. ChiChi's face was slick with perspiration, the light of the stove making her skin glow like polished bronze. Every time she moved the wooden spoon, she was weaving a tapestry of scent that reached far beyond the kitchen walls. Upstairs, in the silent, darkened wing where time seemed to have stopped, the smell reached the room of the starving heir. Do-hyun was lying in his bed, a ghost among the silk sheets, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance that no one else could see. But then, the air changed. The sharp, wake-up call of the Scotch bonnets and the comforting, fatty richness of the palm oil drifted through his door. It was a smell that didn't ask for permission. It was a smell that demanded a reaction. For the first time in weeks, the boy's nostrils flared. His small, pale hand twitched against the blanket. It wasn't just food he was smelling, it was the scent of something warm, something safe, a primal memory of a mother he had nearly forgotten, an echo of a journey taken before he was even born. Downstairs, ChiChi added the final touches, her movements slowing as the meal reached its peak. The red rice was fluffy and steaming, infused with the fire of the peppers and the soul of the spices. She plated the food not on a gold-rimmed porcelain dish, but on a simple, warm ceramic bowl. The silence in the kitchen was no longer mocking. The staff stood paralyzed, their mouths watering despite themselves, drawn in by the magnetic pull of the poor girl's cooking. Sang-won stepped forward, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He looked at the bowl, then at the girl who had turned his cold fortress into a place of fire and life. The air was no longer thick with the scent of cigars and death, it was alive with the smell of home. ChiChi wiped her brow with the back of her hand and looked up at the boss. She didn't need to say a word. The fire was out, the meal was ready, and the battle for the boy's life was about to begin. The ceramic bowl was warm in ChiChi's hands, the heat of the freshly cooked jollof rice seeping through the clay and into her palms. The steam rose in a fragrant veil, carrying with it the sharp, life-giving sting of the Scotch bonnets and the deep, earthy richness of the palm oil. She didn't wait for an invitation. She didn't wait for the head maid to sneer another insult or for the guards to clear a path. She simply turned and began to walk, the rhythmic squelch of her damp shoes the only sound in the sudden, expectant silence of the foyer. Choi Sang-won followed her, his stride heavy and deliberate. He watched the back of this girl, this stranger who had brought fire into his cold house, and felt a tension in his chest that had nothing to do with the wars he fought in the streets. He had spent millions on the finest porcelain and the rarest ingredients, yet he found himself following a girl with a chipped ceramic bowl and a stained apron. As they reached the grand staircase, the light from the crystal chandeliers caught the steam rising from the rice, turning it into a shimmering ribbon of gold that seemed to lead them toward the darkness of the upper wing. They entered Do-hyun's room softly. The space was an ocean of shadows, the only light coming from the pale, sickly glow of a moon obscured by the Incheon rain. The air here was stagnant, smelling of expensive linens and the faint, metallic scent of the medical monitors that stood like silent sentinels around the bed. Do-hyun lay at the center of the vast silk sheets, his body so small and frail that he looked less like a boy and more like a discarded doll. His eyes were open, staring at a corner of the ceiling with a vacant, hollow expression that broke Sang-won's heart anew every time he saw it. ChiChi didn't hesitate. She didn't bow to the boss or ask for permission. She walked straight to the edge of the bed and sat down, her weight making the expensive mattress dip. The head maid, standing at the door, let out a sharp, indrawn breath of scandal, but a single, sideways glance from Sang-won silenced her instantly. ChiChi looked down at the boy. She didn't see the heir to a criminal empire or a patient in need of a miracle. She saw a child who was lonely in a way that no amount of gold could cure. She blew softly on a spoonful of the vibrant red rice, the steam curling around her fingers. "In my home," ChiChi said softly, her voice a low, melodic hum that seemed to vibrate against the clinical silence of the room, "we say that the fire in the pepper is the sun's way of saying hello. It wakes up the heart. It tells the body that it's time to be brave." Do-hyun's eyes drifted slowly from the ceiling. His nostrils flared as the sharp, spicy scent hit him full force. It was an aggressive smell, one that didn't belong in this room of hushed whispers and soft fabrics. It was a smell of life, of heat, and of a world outside these walls. His gaze landed on the bowl, the deep red of the rice a stark contrast to the white silk. ChiChi held the spoon close to his lips. She didn't beg. She didn't plead. She simply waited, her eyes meeting his with a steady, quiet warmth. Sang-won stood at the foot of the bed, his hands gripped so tightly behind his back that his knuckles turned white, his tattoos shifting like shadows over his skin. He held his breath, the weight of his entire empire hanging on a single, tiny movement. Then, it happened. Do-hyun's lips parted. It was a small, uncertain gesture, but to Sang-won, it was as if the very foundations of the mansion had shifted. The boy took the first bite. The heat of the ginger and the spice of the peppers hit his tongue, and for a moment, Do-hyun's eyes widened. His small chest hitched. Everyone in the room froze, expecting him to cough, to pull away, or to throw the bowl as he had done 70 times before. But as the warmth of the palm oil and the richness of the spices washed over him, something ancient and buried deep in his blood began to stir. It was a flavor he didn't know he remembered, a spicy, comforting echo of a journey his mother had taken while he was still tucked beneath her heart. He swallowed. Then, he reached out a pale, thin hand and gripped ChiChi's wrist, pulling the spoon back toward his mouth. ChiChi smiled, a radiant, genuine expression that transformed her face. She fed him another spoonful, and then another. The boy who hadn't touched food in weeks was eating with a sudden, desperate hunger, his small body leaning into the warmth of the meal. The silence in the room was no longer heavy with grief, it was crackling with the electricity of a miracle. As Do-hyun reached the bottom of the bowl, a faint, rosy color began to creep into his ghostly cheeks. He looked up at ChiChi, and then, slowly, his lips curved upward. It wasn't the practiced, polite smile of a boss's heir. It was the shy, bright smile of a child who had finally found his way home. Sang-won felt a sudden, sharp sting in his eyes. He leaned against the doorframe, the iron-hard exterior he had spent decades building finally beginning to crumble. For years, he had lived in a world of shadows, of death, and of cold, hard certainties. He had forgotten what it felt like to believe in something he couldn't buy or break. But as he watched his son, his only light, his only reason for being, laughing softly as ChiChi wiped a stray grain of rice from his chin, the Mafia boss felt a sensation he had thought was dead forever. He felt hope. It was a small, fragile thing, like the flame of ChiChi's stove, but it was enough to burn away the darkness of the mansion. He looked at ChiChi, really looked at her, and realized that she hadn't just saved his son's life. She had saved his soul. The gold, the power, and the empire meant nothing compared to the sound of that small, happy sigh. In that darkened room in Incheon, the fire had been lit, and the world would never be cold again. The silence that followed Do-hyun's first full meal was not the heavy, suffocating quiet of a tomb, but the expectant hush of a dawn. The boy had fallen into a deep, natural sleep, his small chest rising and falling with a rhythm that no longer felt like a struggle for survival. ChiChi sat by the bed for a long time, her hands resting in her lap, watching the color slowly return to his face. Behind her, Choi Sang-won stood like a statue carved from shadow, his dark eyes fixed on the empty ceramic bowl as if it were a holy relic. He didn't speak until they were out in the hallway, the heavy oak door clicking shut with a soft, final thud. Sang-won turned to ChiChi, his presence overwhelming in the narrow corridor. The flickering light of the wall sconces played over the dark ink of the tattoos on his neck, making them look like coiled serpents. For the first time, he didn't look at her with the suspicion of a boss or the coldness of a man who bought and sold lives. He looked at her with a raw, piercing curiosity that bordered on reverence. "What did you put in that rice?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "I have hired men who can turn gold into soup. I have flown in ingredients that are illegal to export. Why did a bowl of rice and peppers do what they could not?" ChiChi wiped a smudge of soot from her cheek, her exhaustion finally beginning to show. "It isn't magic, Mr. Choi," she replied softly. "It's memory. Some things are written in the blood before a child is even born. I used palm oil from my village. I used the heat of the Scotch bonnet. It is a taste of home, but not a home he has ever seen with his eyes." Sang-won frowned, the words sparking a dormant memory in the back of his mind. He turned away without a word and began to walk toward the north wing of the mansion, toward a room that had remained locked and untouched for 5 years. ChiChi followed him, her heartbeat echoing the heavy thud of his boots on the carpet. He pulled a heavy brass key from his vest and opened the door to his late wife's private study. The air inside was cool and smelled of dried lavender and old paper. Sang-won didn't turn on the overhead lights. Instead, he lit a single lamp on a mahogany desk piled with journals and leather-bound planners. He began to leaf through them with a frantic energy, his tattooed fingers moving ghost-like over the pages. Finally, he pulled out a small, travel-worn diary with a frayed silk bookmark. He opened it to a section dated 7 years ago. As he read, his face transformed. The hard lines of his jaw softened, and his eyes grew distant, flooded with a grief so sharp it seemed to vibrate in the air. He turned the book toward ChiChi, pointing to a series of photographs tucked into the back. They were pictures of a beautiful Korean woman with a radiant, adventurous smile. She was standing in a vibrant, sun-drenched market, surrounded by women in colorful head wraps and stalls overflowing with yams, bright red peppers, and jars of thick, orange oil. In the photos, she was visibly pregnant, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. "My wife, Hannah," Sang-won said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. Before Do-hyun was born, she spent 3 months in West Africa on a business expansion project that turned into a journey of the soul. She came back changed. She used to talk about the heat, the red earth, and the food that made her feel alive. She spent weeks trying to recreate the flavors she found in Lagos and Abuja, but she could never find the right spices in Seoul. She used to say the baby was moving more when she ate those peppers than at any other time. He looked back at the photos, then at ChiChi. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Do-hyun didn't lose his appetite because he was sick, he whispered. He lost it because he was looking for her. He was looking for the last thing they shared before the world became cold. ChiChi reached out, her fingers hovering just above the photograph of the market. "The body remembers what the mind forgets," she said gently. While he was in her womb, he tasted the fire of the Scotch bonnet and the richness of the oil. To him, that isn't African food. It is the taste of his mother's love. It is the only thing that makes him feel like she is still here. Sang-won sank into the leather chair, the weight of his empire finally seeming too heavy for his shoulders. All his power, all his violence, and all his billions had been useless because he was fighting a ghost. He had tried to nourish his son with status and luxury, when all the boy wanted was a connection to the woman he had lost. He looked at ChiChi, seeing her now not as a girl in a tattered apron, but as the bridge between his son and the past. She was the only person in the world who could speak the language of Do-hyun's hunger. A strange, uncharacteristic warmth spread through the Mafia boss's chest. For 5 years, he had been a man living in a fortress of ice, but tonight, the fire ChiChi had lit in the kitchen had finally reached his heart. "You didn't just feed him, ChiChi," Sang-won said, looking up at her with a look of profound, humbled gratitude. "You brought her back to us." The Incheon rain continued to drum against the windows, but inside the room, the shadows seemed less imposing. The secret was out. The mystery of the starving heir was solved not by medicine, but by the enduring power of a mother's memory, carried across an ocean in the simple spices of a girl who had dared to knock on a monster's door. The morning sun that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Incheon estate seemed to carry a new kind of light, one that didn't just illuminate the cold marble but seemed to warm it. The mansion, once a tomb of silence and shadows, was now echoing with sounds that the guards and maids found profoundly unsettling yet strangely magnetic. It was the sound of a child's laughter, thin and delicate as glass, but unmistakably real. ChiChi did not stay confined to the kitchen. With the silent, watchful permission of Choi Sang-won, she moved through the house like a soft breeze, carrying Do-hyun in her wake. She didn't treat him like a fragile patient or a prince to be feared, she treated him like a younger brother who had been away from the sun for too long. In the sun-drenched breakfast nook, she replaced the heavy silver cutlery with colorful wooden bowls she had brought in her pack, and she began the work of feeding not just his body, but his mind. "Kidu," she would ask, her voice a low, rhythmic melody as she sat him on a stool next to her while she prepped vegetables. When the boy looked at her with wide, curious eyes, she would tap her chest. "It means, how are you, in my language Igbo. Can you say it?" "Kodu?" Do-hyun's first attempt was a tiny, breathy whisper. "Kodu?" ChiChi's face lit up with a grin so bright it made the head maid, who was polishing silver nearby, pause in mid-motion. "Odima. That means it is good. You are a natural, Do-hyun. You have the soul of a traveler. As the days passed, the cultural landscape of the mansion began to shift. ChiChi began to play music from her phone, high-life rhythms and Afrobeat tracks that pulsed with a heartbeat the stone walls had never felt. At first, the guards stood stiffly, their hands on their holstered weapons, confused by the vibrant syncopation. But slowly, the tension in their shoulders began to drop. The house was no longer a place where men only waited for orders of violence. It was a place where a small boy was learning to count in a tongue from across the sea. Otu, Abuo, Otto, Do-hyun would recite, his small fingers following ChiChi's as they counted out plantain slices. She brought color into the gray. One afternoon, she produced a length of vibrant Ankara fabric, a swirl of deep indigo and sun yellow, and draped it over the back of the clinical leather sofa in the library. She told Do-hyun stories of the red dust of Lagos, of the giant baobab trees that held the secrets of ancestors, and of markets so loud and joyful they could be heard from the heavens. She taught him that his mother hadn't just visited a place, she had fallen in love with a spirit of resilience, and that same spirit was now part of him. Choi Sang-won watched these transformations from the shadows of the hallways, a ghost haunting his own reviving home. He saw his son, who used to flinch at the sound of a raised voice, now reaching out to touch the rough texture of the fabric ChiChi wore. He saw the boy's eyes, once hollow and fixed on the ceiling, now sparkling with the effort of learning new words. Dalu, Do-hyun said one evening as his father entered the room, the Igbo word for thank you sounding like a prayer in the quiet air. Sang-won felt a strange, tightening ache in his chest. He was a man who understood power in the form of fear and debt, but the power ChiChi wielded was something else entirely. She was the unlikely matriarch, a girl with no title and no weapons, who had staged a bloodless coup against the grief that had ruled his house. She was teaching his son to be brave, to be curious, and to find joy in a world that had previously only offered him gold and shadows. The staff, once mocking and cold, began to follow her lead. The younger maids started asking ChiChi about the spices she used, drawn in by the warmth she radiated. Even the most hardened guards would linger a moment longer near the sunroom, listening to the stories of the tortoise and the wisdom of the elders. The mansion was no longer a fortress protecting a dying heir, it was becoming a home. But as the laughter grew louder and the colors grew brighter, Sang-won knew that the world outside, the world of blood, tradition, and rivalries, was watching. For now, however, he allowed himself the luxury of watching ChiChi lean over his son, her dark hand over his small, pale one, as they traced the shape of a world that was no longer divided by oceans. The piece within the mansion walls was a fragile glass sculpture, beautiful and clear, but the world outside was already throwing stones. While ChiChi taught Do-hyun the songs of her ancestors, the shadow of the Incheon underworld was lengthening. It began with the telephoto lenses of paparazzi perched on the hillsides, capturing blurred images of a black woman in a vibrant apron playing in the garden with the heir to the Choi Empire. Then came the headlines. The tabloids and digital news cycles were merciless, fueled by a mixture of shock and deep-seated prejudice. The Dragon of Incheon's secret African maid, one headline screamed, while others questioned if the most powerful man in the city had lost his mind, or his strength. Inside the house, ChiChi felt the shift before she saw it. The guards grew tenser, their hands never straying far from their weapons, and the head maid's lingering resentment found new life in the cruel comments she accidentally let ChiChi overhear. ChiChi found a discarded newspaper in the kitchen, the ink staining her fingers as she read the xenophobic vitriol directed at her. She looked at the photo of herself in Do-hyun, a moment of pure joy captured and twisted into a scandal. For a moment, her resolve wavered. She wasn't a soldier, she was a cook who had only wanted to save a child. She began to wonder if her presence was doing more harm than good to the man who had given her a chance. Choi Sang-won saw the newspaper on the counter that evening. He didn't say a word, but the air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. His business partners were calling, their voices thick with thinly veiled mockery. They saw his domestic happiness as a leak in his armor. To them, a mafia boss who spent his evenings learning the names of African spices was a man who had grown soft. They didn't understand that for the first time in his life, Sang-won had something worth fighting for that wasn't made of cold stone or blood-soaked cash. The confrontation came on a Thursday night, during the monthly summit of the 5 ruling families of Incheon. Usually held in a high-end, traditional Korean restaurant, Sang-won had insisted on hosting it at his estate. He wanted them to see the truth. The other bosses arrived with their entourages, men with scarred faces and cold eyes who looked at the colorful encore fabrics draped in the foyer with open derision. Leading the descent was Lee Kong-dae, an older, traditionalist boss who had long coveted Sang-won's territory. During dinner, as the staff served a fusion of Korean and Nigerian small plates that ChiChi had meticulously prepared, Kong-dae pushed his plate away with a theatrical sigh. "We came here to discuss the expansion of the ports, Sang-won, not to be fed the scraps of a foreign kitchen," Kong-dae sneered, his voice carrying across the silent table. "The streets are laughing. They say the dragon has been tamed by a girl who doesn't even know her place. They say you've traded your fire for palm oil." The room went deathly silent. Sang-won's guards moved instinctively, but he held up a tattooed hand, stopping them. He leaned forward, the light of the chandelier glinting off the dark ink on his neck. "The girl you speak of did what 70 of your traditional experts could not," Sang-won said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "She brought my son back from the grave. If you find her food beneath you, Kong-dae, perhaps it's because your palate has grown as stale as your loyalty." Kong-dae stood up, his chair screeching against the marble. "You bring a poor foreigner into this house and expect us to treat her like a queen? You've grown weak, Choi. You're distracted by a maid, and a weak leader is a liability to us all." Just then, ChiChi entered the room to clear the plates. She had heard the raised voices, the mockery in their tone. She stood tall, her apron tied tight, her eyes meeting Kong-dae's with the same unflinching fire she had used to face the stove. Kong-dae reached out, intending to shove her aside as a show of dominance, but he never got the chance. In a blur of motion, Sang-won was on his feet. He caught Kong-dae's wrist in a grip that sounded like drywood snapping. The sheer violence of the movement sent a clear message: the dragon had not been tamed, he had found a new reason to burn. "She is not a maid," Sang-won hissed into Kong-dae's face, his eyes twin voids of darkness. "She is the heart of this house. And if you ever lay a hand on her, or breathe another word of disrespect toward her, I will personally ensure you never eat another meal again." He flung Kong-dae's hand back. The other bosses watched in stunned silence as the older man stumbled, his face turning a shade of purple. Sang-won turned to ChiChi, his expression softening for just a fraction of a second, a silent apology for the world he had brought her into. "The dinner is over," Sang-won announced, his voice echoing through the mansion. "Get out. All of you. And tell the streets this: the dragon of Incheon doesn't care about your judgment. I have found my strength in the fire of this kitchen, and I will burn anyone who tries to extinguish it." As the rivals retreated into the rainy night, ChiChi stood in the empty dining room, the adrenaline finally fading into a cold shiver. Sang-won walked over to her, his heavy presence both terrifying and deeply comforting. He didn't apologize again. In his world, protection was the only apology that mattered. But as he looked at her, ChiChi realized that the war wasn't just about his son anymore. It was about them. The underworld had passed its judgment, but Choi Sang-won had delivered his verdict. They were no longer just a boss and a cook, they were a family under siege, and the fire ChiChi had lit was now the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. The echoes of the confrontation in the dining hall lingered in the mansion's long, marble corridors like the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. The silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet ChiChi had worked so hard to cultivate, but a heavy, watchful stillness. In the small guest room she had come to call her own, ChiChi sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she looked at the vibrant Ankara fabric she had draped over the chair only days before. The headlines she had seen, the mockery she had heard, and the raw violence she had witnessed in Sang-won's eyes tonight coalesced into a single, terrifying realization. Her presence was no longer just a cure, it was a catalyst for war. She began to pack. Her movements were slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to the fire she had displayed in the kitchen. She folded her worn clothes and tucked her small jars of spices back into the backpack she had carried through the rain on that first Tuesday. She felt like an interloper who had accidentally stepped into the gears of a massive, dangerous machine. She loved Do-hyun with a fierce, maternal protectiveness, and she had seen a side of Choi Sang-won that the world insisted didn't exist, but she couldn't ignore the target she had painted on their backs. If her leaving meant the dragon could return to his cold, untouchable throne without the weight of a foreign scandal, then she had to go. As she reached for the blue and yellow fabric on the chair, the door to her room creaked open. She expected to see Sang-won, his dark eyes filled with either fury or silent understanding. Instead, she saw a small, pale figure standing in the doorway. Do-hyun was dressed in his favorite pajamas, the ones ChiChi had picked out because they were the color of the Nigerian sky at dusk. He looked at the open backpack on the bed, and the light in his eyes, the light ChiChi had fought so hard to relight, flickered and died. ChiChi, he whispered, his voice small and brittle in the vastness of the room. ChiChi felt a sharp, physical pain in her chest. She knelt down so she was eye level with him, trying to keep her expression steady. Do-hyun, it's late. You should be sleeping. The boy didn't move. He pointed a trembling finger at the bag. You are putting the spices away. Why are you putting the fire away? Sometimes, ChiChi began, her voice thick with unshed tears, people like me are like the Scotch bonnets I use. We bring a lot of heat, but if there's too much of it, we burn the people we care about. Your father is a powerful man, but the people outside, they are being mean because I am here. If I stay, they will keep trying to hurt this house. Do-hyun stepped into the room, his small feet silent on the carpet. He didn't cry. Instead, he looked at her with a profound, ancient sadness that reminded her of the ghost he had been when she first arrived. He reached out and gripped the sleeve of her tattered jacket, his knuckles turning white with the effort. I was a ghost, he said, the words coming out in a rush of broken Korean and the Igbo words she had taught him. Before the jollof rice, before the stories of the tortoise, I was waiting to go to where a mama is. The doctors gave me medicine that tasted like metal. The chefs gave me gold that tasted like nothing. But you gave me your heart, ChiChi. You gave me Odima. He looked up at her, his eyes pleading. If you go, the cold will come back. The shadows will come back. I don't care about the people outside. I don't care if they laugh. Please, do not leave me in the dark again. Dalu. Please stay. ChiChi pulled him into a hug, burying her face in his hair. She could feel his heart beating against her own, a strong, steady rhythm that she had helped build. In that moment, the logic of the underworld and the fear of the media felt insignificant compared to the weight of the boy in her arms. She realized that leaving wouldn't protect him, it would only empty him out again. She was no longer just a cook. She was the anchor keeping his soul from drifting away. A shadow fell across the doorway, and ChiChi looked up to see Choi Sang-won standing there. He had discarded his vest, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the dark ink of the dragon on his chest. He looked at the backpack, then at his son clinging to the girl from Lagos. He didn't move to pull them apart. He didn't offer her money to stay or threats if she left. The world thinks I am weak because I let you in, Sang-won said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. They think I have traded my teeth for a home. But they don't understand that for the first time in 5 years, I have something I would burn the entire city to protect. You think you are a burden, ChiChi. But to us, you are the only thing that is real. He stepped into the room and placed a heavy, tattooed hand on Do-hyun's shoulder, but his eyes remained fixed on ChiChi. If you walk out that gate, you are leaving your family behind. And a Choi never abandons family. Stay. Let them scream. Let them mock. I will be the shield, and you will be the fire. That is the only deal I am interested in making. ChiChi looked from the powerful man to the small boy, then back to the backpack. Slowly, she reached out and tipped the bag over, letting her few belongings spill back onto the bed. She picked up the Ankara fabric and draped it back over the chair, the vibrant colors defiant against the mansion's gray stone. I'm staying, she whispered. Do-hyun let out a long, shaky sigh of relief and squeezed her tighter. Sang-won didn't smile, it wasn't in his nature, but the predatory tension in his jaw relaxed, replaced by a quiet, ironclad resolve. The war with the outside world was far from over, and the judgment of the underworld would only grow louder, but inside that room, the choice had been made. The girl with the apron wasn't going anywhere, and the dragon of Incheon finally had a reason to fight that was worth more than gold. The grand hall of the Incheon Maritime Club was a palace of cold glass and polished obsidian, a place where the city's legitimate elite rubbed shoulders with its most dangerous shadows. On this night, the air was thick with the scent of vintage cognac and the unspoken tension of a brewing coup. Every major player in the underworld was present, their eyes darting toward the empty head table where the seat of the dragon waited. The rumors had reached a fever pitch. The streets were whispering that Choi Sang-won had finally traded his steel for a wooden spoon, and that his empire was ripe for the taking. When the heavy gilded doors finally swung open, a collective hush fell over the room, so sudden and absolute that the clinking of crystal seemed to echo like breaking ice. Choi Sang-won did not enter alone, nor did he enter with an army of soldiers at his back. He walked with a steady, predatory grace, his hand firmly interlaced with ChiChi's. She was a vision of defiant beauty, a living bridge between two worlds. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that hugged her frame, but draped over her shoulder was a sash of her finest Ankara fabric, a bold explosion of gold and crimson that stood out against the monochrome sea of black suits like a wildfire in a desert. Beside them, holding ChiChi's other hand, was Do-hyun. The boy was no longer the fading ghost of a child, his cheeks were full, his eyes were bright with a newfound curiosity, and he walked with a pride that mirrored his father's. The whispers began almost immediately, a low, poisonous hum that vibrated through the ballroom. There she is, they hissed. The foreign maid. The scandal of Incheon. Sang-won ignored them, leading ChiChi and Do-hyun to the center of the raised dais. He didn't sit. He stood at the microphone, his dark eyes scanning the room until the murmurs died in the throats of the men who uttered them. Standing at the front of the crowd was Lee Kong-dae, his face a mask of smug satisfaction, flanked by the other 4 ruling families. He looked ready to deliver a eulogy for Sang-won's reputation. For 20 years, I have sat at this table, Sang-won began, his voice a low, resonant rumble that carried to every corner of the hall. I have built an empire on the strength of my name and the sharpness of my blade. You all came here tonight expecting to see a man who has grown weak. You came here to see if the rumors were true, that I have been tamed by the fire of a kitchen. He paused, his hand tightening almost imperceptibly on ChiChi's. You were right about one thing. I have changed. I spent 5 years protecting a throne that felt like a tomb. I protected a legacy that was starving my only son to death. I lived in the dark because I thought that was the only way to rule. He turned to ChiChi, his expression softening in a way that shocked the hardened men below. Then, this woman walked through my gates. She didn't bring weapons, and she didn't bring a title. She brought a flame that was older and stronger than any war I have ever fought. She fed my son when the world had given him up for dead. She brought life back into a house that had forgotten how to breathe. Lee Kong-dae stepped forward, his voice dripping with venom. A touching story, Sang-won. But a dragon cannot rule with a maid by his side. You are choosing a scandal over your duty. You are choosing a foreigner over your people. If you do this, you forfeit the throne. Sang-won looked at Kong-dae, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face, the smile of a man who had already won. You think the throne is the prize, Kong-dae? You think this crown of thorns is what makes a man powerful? In a move that shattered every tradition of the Incheon underworld, Sang-won reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, a simple, elegant band of gold set with a rare, sun-colored diamond that matched the patterns in ChiChi's fabric. He dropped to one knee in front of her, right there in front of the men who wanted him dead and the media that wanted to tear her apart. ChiChi Okoye, he said, his voice steady and clear, reaching past the dangerous men to the woman who had saved his soul. I do not offer you a throne of blood. I offer you a home. I offer you a life where we build something new together, a legacy that bridges our worlds and honors the fire you brought into my life. I am choosing my family. I am choosing you. Will you be my wife? Will you be the mother of the Choi line, not by blood, but by love? The room went completely silent. It was a declaration of war against the old ways, a public decree that the dragon was no longer interested in the throne if it meant losing his heart. ChiChi looked down at him, her eyes shimmering with tears, but her posture remained as regal as any queen. She looked at Do-hyun, who was clapping his small hands in silent encouragement, and then back at the man who had been a monster to the world but a protector to her. Yes, she whispered, her voice carrying through the silence like a song. Odima. Yes. As Sang-won slipped the ring onto her finger and stood up to kiss her, a few of the younger associates began to applaud, moved by a story that transcended their violent reality. But for the rival bosses, the message was clear. Choi Sang-won hadn't grown weak, he had found a reason to be invincible. He had chosen his family over the crown, and in doing so, he had become the most powerful man Incheon had ever seen. The old world was dying, but in the heat of ChiChi's fire, a new one was being born. The transformation of the Choi Empire did not happen overnight, but it began with the same fierce intentionality that Choi Sang-won had once used to rule the streets of Incheon. The transition from the underworld to the world of global commerce was a journey paved with the scent of Scotch bonnets and the rich, golden hue of imported palm oil. Sang-won had spent a lifetime controlling the city's ports for shadow cargo, but now those same shipping lanes were filled with the vibrant colors of West African spices, hand-selected by ChiChi and her family in Lagos. He had traded his title of dragon for the role of a mogul, a man who realized that the most sustainable power was not built on blood, but on the soul of a home. In the heart of Seoul's most prestigious district, a new kind of landmark arose, Odima Fusion. The building was a masterpiece of architectural harmony, blending the minimalist, sharp lines of modern Korean design with the warm, earthy textures of Nigerian craftsmanship. On its opening night, the line of people stretched around the block, not out of fear or obligation, but out of a desperate curiosity to taste the food that had famously healed the heir to the Choi fortune. Inside, the air was a thick, intoxicating symphony of ginger, garlic, and perilla leaves, a sensory proof that two worlds, once thought to be irreconcilable, could create something beautiful together. ChiChi stood at the center of the kitchen, no longer the rain-drenched girl in a tattered jacket, but a culinary visionary in a custom-tailored apron that bore the family's new crest. She moved with the same quiet strength she had possessed since her first day at the stove, her dark hands moving with practiced grace as she showed her team how to balance the heat of the Nigerian peppers with the delicate sweetness of Korean pear. She wasn't just a chef, she was the matriarch of a legitimate dynasty. Beside her, Do-hyun often stood on a small wooden stool, his eyes bright with health and excitement as he helped her stir the heavy iron pots. He was no longer the silent, starving ghost. He was a boy who spoke 3 languages fluently and knew the names of every spice in the pantry. The social prejudice that had once threatened to tear them apart had withered in the face of their undeniable success. The same business partners who had mocked Sang-won's foreign cook now begged for reservations at the head table. The media, once so cruel and xenophobic, now hailed them as the ultimate symbol of a modern, multicultural Korea. Sang-won watched this shift with a quiet, ironical smile. He knew the world hadn't changed, but he had. He no longer needed to intimidate his rivals because he had surpassed them in a way they couldn't comprehend. He was a man who went home every night to a house filled with music, laughter, and the lingering warmth of a shared meal. 10 years after that rainy Tuesday morning, the family celebrated their anniversary in the garden of the mansion. The estate was no longer a fortress, the iron gates were often open, and the cold marble had been softened by the presence of 2 more children, a daughter with Sang-won's piercing eyes and a son with ChiChi's radiant smile. They played in the grass, their laughter echoing the same joy that had first broken the mansion's silence a decade ago. Sang-won stood on the terrace, his hand resting on ChiChi's shoulder as they watched their children. The dark ink on his neck was still there, a reminder of the man he used to be, but it was now a map of a past that no longer defined his future. The legacy they built was more than a business, it was a testament to the fact that the most unexpected love stories are often the most powerful. Do-hyun eventually followed in ChiChi's footsteps, becoming a world-renowned chef in his own right, dedicated to writing cookbooks that explored the healing power of comfort food. He never forgot the taste of that first bowl of jollof rice, the meal that had called him back from the edge of the dark. The lesson of their lives remained simple yet profound. Love and home cooking had conquered a world of fear. They proved that no matter how deep the grief or how wide the cultural divide, a seat at the table and a shared bowl of food could mend a broken soul. As the sun set over Incheon, casting a golden light over the Choi estate, the air was no longer thick with the scent of cigars and secrets. It was alive with the smell of spices, the warmth of a fire that would never go out, and the quiet, enduring peace of a family that had finally found its way home.